Who's with us too, told me that Tracey was coming to visit family. Unfortunately, it's conveniently located over July 4th, so now we have a July 5th event, and as many of you know, this is Tracey's hometown, Westchester, in a lovely library. So I really appreciate everyone else coming out tonight, because if you know who Tracey is, or you'll learn, she knows as much or more about the subject than anyone, and she's done more to save lives than almost anyone. I think your naloxone distribution has been documented of saving how many lives? More than 300?
Yes, 327.
Which is an amazing accomplishment when you think about it. And we have wonderful people here from Lindsay, who's run in Hamilton County, the most aggressive, well-funded, well-done Narcan distribution in all of Ohio, sort of the exception to our mediocre to bad naloxone distribution. So thanks so much, Tracey.
Well, that's an interesting introduction. I have no problem having to live up to that. So I'm Tracey Helton. So my presentation is going to take a few different forms. I'm going to talk about sort of my personal journey with opioids, and then I'm going to talk about how I got involved in advocacy work. I'm going to talk a little bit about the landscape of, I don't like to call it the opioid crisis, I call it the overdose crisis that we're having here in the United States. And then I'll end by kind of talking about how you could potentially get involved, because I think if you're here, you either have a personal stake or you're very interested in finding out about opioids. So I am originally from Westchester, Ohio. I grew up not very far from here. I'm kind of confused because this whole area was farms when I was growing up. And I mean, the street that I grew up on was a dead-end street with a dead raccoon that was there for like 2 or 3 years. With this little pelt hanging off of like a ex-farmer's fence. So it's interesting that a person from rural Ohio would then become addicted to heroin, but that was sort of what happened for me. So as some people, Julie and some other people, another person was here can attest to, I was very straight-laced when I was growing up. I was in the gifted and talented classes. I wasn't a person who was any kind of problems for my parents. And that was partially because there was so much chaos sort of going on in my household when I was growing up, with my father being a very severe alcoholic and then other kind of issues of substance abuse in the family. So I was actually diagnosed as having depression when I was 12 years old by Miss Miller, the school counselor at Hope Elementary. They had suggested that maybe it wasn't normal for a child to be walking around in their pajamas for 2 weeks at a time without bathing. And so there was all this, this is the 70s where people didn't really talk very much about what was going on in their house. So my mother was very focused on trying to get my father to stop drinking, and that was sort of like her driver for her whole entire life. And when he died, she actually died 4 months later because she said she had lost her purpose. So she had gone to Al-Anon. I was familiar with, we always had she would leave little AA pamphlets around the house as Bill sees it, the footprints in the sand, all these different kind of things related to, to recovery, hoping that someday my dad would get that, and that wasn't the case. He never got sober. He died as a result of alcoholism. Although he did stop drinking hard liquor, but apparently a beer is a beverage. It's not actually alcohol, so he never really stopped drinking those. And he's from the generation where beer is a beverage, so it's not really alcohol to him. So I used drugs for the first time before I was 8 years old. I was exposed to drugs by relatives. I don't want to get into too much specifics since we're being taped, but my sister's friends had introduced me to drugs and alcohol, and then I didn't do any of that kind of stuff all through until the very, very end of high school. And I had started smoking pot a little bit and drinking, which is pretty much experimentation that people do at that age. But I remember in particular when I had my wisdom teeth pulled, having the experience of being on opioids and really, really liking the way that had felt. And I really wasn't into drinking that much or smoking pot, but I really, really liked the way that opioids felt. And some people describe that opioids treat untreated depression. So I wasn't on any kind of psychiatric medications. And so when we talk about this section of the country, Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, opioids is antidepressants for that population, for people who are not getting appropriate mental health care. There isn't a lot of work that was being done with adolescents and depression back then. So I started experimenting. So I went to University of Cincinnati. I had tested out of almost my whole first year of college, and I was drinking a little bit, but I had gotten this really terrible relationship. And when that relationship ended, he told me I was fat, I was stupid, I was lazy, I was never going to be shit, I was never going to do shit without him. I really was interested in medicating those feelings. And I think everybody's experience with addiction is sort of different, wanting to feel differently, would be out of yourself, not wanting to experience pain. But then I started transitioning into doing opioids. So the number one way, back then, and up until recently, people would get opioids is people would have opioids left over from surgeries. So your parents would get a knee surgery, a shoulder surgery, maybe you had a surgery even as teenagers. They would give you opioids. And so me and my friends would go through the medicine cabinets, back a couple bottles, behind the aspirin or whatever, Tiger Balm would be a bottle of opioids. And so you would take them, and you have a couple drinks, and you would experience that feeling. And it was very clear early on that my desire to use opioids and other people's desires were totally divergent. They were not the same thing. So very early on, I had another friend who had injected opioids, and he had said, you're wasting this. So generally, when there's a person who's getting into drugs, there's another person who's interested in facilitating you getting into drugs even more. So because that pays for their ability to use drugs. So if he's using drugs, if I'm using drugs, he's using my drugs. So that was sort of my experience, and it's not particular to any gender, but that was my experience, and that was my experience everywhere I've lived, and I've lived all over the United States. Is that there's a facilitator. There's a facilitator, the two codependents, or the two people whose addiction is fueling each other. So we had started. So I had one syringe that I had for a year. So I don't think that is an unusual Ohio experience. That's the experience of some people today. So even today in the United States, we have people that are making their own syringes. So in Iran, you can get free methadone and free syringes. But in the United States, people can't even get one syringe. So I had the same syringe, and it was something out of like a William S. Burroughs novel where we were sharpening it on matchbooks. I knew people that used to get saline IVs and hook themselves up so they could shoot up in the same port so they wouldn't have to continually poke themselves. It basically was self-mutilation. There was one point in particular I remember doing drugs over a 2-day period, and my hands swelled so much I couldn't put them down because they were so swollen it was like a fish hook would pull your skin up. So I think pretty much everybody I used with, and so I'm working at Part1 Imports now. I'm at University of Cincinnati, so this is not like some experience where I'm like shaking and shivering on some street corner. Like I'm working, going to school, and I'm shooting heroin. I'm shooting opioids, and then I'm shooting heroin. So, and we all shared the same syringe, and you would hope that it didn't break off in somebody's arm. And so when people imagine who's using opioids, they don't really imagine the person who's going to school and working, that's what's happening. But I think the United States kind of needs to wake up to the fact that the rates of hepatitis C are skyrocketing. These HIV rates there's clusters of HIV all over the country. We just had one in Indiana, there's one in Massachusetts, Miami, where people in little communities are all sharing the same syringe, all using, because they have no access to them. So even in a state where it's legal to purchase syringes at the pharmacy, the pharmacist at his discretion can refuse to sell them to you. So I could walk into the pharmacy right now and they could refuse to sell it to me. So that's a child a friend, a child, people I know who have adult children, that's their child. It's kind of horrifying to think about. So my little cluster of friends that I hung out with, all of them have hepatitis C. I cleared the hepatitis C virus on my own, but some of them have since died from their liver exploded from them having hepatitis that they got back in that period of time. So they used to call it hepatitis non-A, non-B. So there should have been a way. So my first overdose was in 1990, I overdosed on heroin. There was, back then if you overdosed, people would pull you outside and call the paramedics, and hopefully you didn't die after they went through your pockets. And so you wouldn't want anybody's child to end up like that, but that was really how it used to be. I was fortunate in that my friend gave me rescue breathing until I came back, and that should have been like a wake-up call for me, but it was not. It was not a wake-up call for me. And I continued to use heroin for many, many years after that, 8 more years after that. I'm a polysubstance user. So now when I was at lunch today, they were saying, when I was getting tattooed, they were saying now the problem out here is meth too. All the people have died of overdoses, and now they're all using meth. So I have a lot of experience with shooting meth that I won't get into, but meth in particular is where very, very risky behaviors with sex and syringes occurs. Where I've seen people pick up a syringe that had blood all over it and go to use it and stick it in their arm because they're so sleep deprived and not sure what they're doing. And I was using in San Francisco when the vast majority of the drug users there had AIDS, and we'd be like, look, there's no HIV meds at the time. You can't just pick up a syringe and use it, and people are just so out of their mind they're doing it anyway. And having sex with no condoms, I know people that have never used sex, they've never had sex with a condom in their addiction, never. And so, one of the things that was going on back then also was that a condom, if you were caught for a sex case, could be used as furtherance of evidence in a prostitution case. So if you're carrying condoms, you're a sex worker, and we can now use that against you. So there's a lot of things that are going on that are still happening today. So now we're talking about 1990, it's 2018. So to kind of fast forward, I ended up being homeless in San Francisco. I went out there for spring break and I never left. I was using heroin. So we had tar heroin. Out here you have what's called ECP, East Coast Powder, and tar. It's very, very easy to put fentanyl and fentanyl analogs in powder. There's no way of telling what it is. There's no way. So as a policy, when I do overdose education, we tell people any drug that you do in the United States today, assume there's fentanyl in it. A lot of people don't even bother with the test strips. Just assume there's fentanyl in it because it's in the cocaine, it's in the meth, it's in everything. They're mixing it up on tables where it's getting cross-contamination. Assume that all the drugs that you do have fentanyl in it, unless you're getting it from the pharmacy. It has fentanyl. And people don't want to hear that. That's not the message. They want to believe that it's isolated to the heroin over here, so I don't need to worry about that. And my child's not using heroin, my friend's not using heroin. I know of a girl 2 weeks ago, she's friends with all my friends, she just died from snorting cocaine that had fentanyl in it. 2 weeks ago. So in San Francisco, we had 3 people die from meth that had fentanyl in it. So it's in the drug supply, period. I don't know why it's in the drug supply. We could talk about all day the factors, but that's not really where I'm going with this today. So the first thing that we want to work on is reducing mortality, stopping people from dying. So you can think whatever you want about the prohibition of drugs, drug use, drug users, but I think we all can agree that me sitting here today, it's a good thing that I didn't die. I have 3 beautiful children. I have a master's degree, I have a bachelor's degree, I have a substance abuse certificate, I own my own home. I have a husband who's put up with me for 18 years. I don't know why sometimes. And he supports me traveling the country and doing these kind of talks. But if it wasn't for harm reduction, I absolutely would be dead now. So I was using drugs when all my friends had HIV, AIDS, died. I don't have HIV. I cleared the hepatitis C virus. I have been revived from an overdose with naloxone. I've survived. I've outlived. It's like survival of it's like survivor on a life scale. Like I've outlived all my peers. And so now the sad part is I'm watching people 30 and under all die off. So I call it generation overdose. So if we were to pull 5 under 30s here, I would say almost all of them would know at least 5 people who died of an overdose. So that's not even if you use drugs. That's not even if you use drugs, because it's wiping out a whole generation of people. And so that has to stop. That, no matter what you think, you have to, I think we all can agree that has to stop. And so what happened for me was in 1999, I started working at doing overdose prevention. So San Francisco, it's almost humorous in retrospect. We had around 198 overdoses. We thought that was a lot of overdoses at the time. You know, now we're talking about cities where they're having thousands of overdoses a year. Less than 200 people, we thought, we're having an overdose crisis. We have to do something. So they started teaching people like myself to go educate people who are using. We had this Fix with a Friend campaign, and then they sent me to, we were teaching rescue breathing in the jails. They sent me to Seattle, where I heard this man called Dan Big talk about how we should give, this was in the early stages, we should just give Narcan to people, we should just give it to people and have them save each other. And I was like, what the fuck is he talking about? You know what I mean? Because this is something that the paramedics just have, and it was just, I couldn't understand what he was saying, but I was all about it. I believed in that. So the first city-sponsored naloxone program was in San Francisco in 2003. I used to work at that. I worked at that program. So we're talking about now 2003 versus 2018, where only something like 8 to 10% of people even have access to naloxone in the whole United States. So I decided to start sending, so I got sober in 1998. Sober is a term that I use. I personally am completely abstinent from all drugs, but that does not make me special. I don't think, oh, I'm sober, but you're on methadone, so you're not special. You know, it's like, I think any form of recovery is important. So if you're on Suboxone, if you're on methadone, if you smoke weed and it helps you stay off hard drugs, I don't judge anybody. I think whatever positive change a person can make, that's what I'm in favor of. And for me, I learned from trying, the last thing that I used crystal meth, cocaine, heroin, alcohol, and benzodiazepines. I was shooting up in the bottoms of my feet. I could barely walk. I had no veins left. I would spend hours poking myself with a needle. And I went into a program, but the program is not the reason that I'm not using drugs today. The program was just a place for me to go. So in the time that I have been off drugs, which is 20 years, the treatment stays are shorter. They're much, much more expensive. What you get for the dollar is almost useless. I mean, parents contact me all the time, should I take out a second mortgage on my house to send my child to rehab? And almost always I say no. Because you could take a trip to Costa Rica with the recovery coach and spend less money than going to a lot of the treatment facilities in the United States. You don't even know what you're getting. You don't even know, if your insurance will pay for it, that's great. But if you're actually talking about yourself and your child might leave in one day, I don't know that, and you're putting out $40,000, I don't know that I can personally say that that's worth it. And I've worked in the treatment field for 20 years. Treatment stage used to be until you were ready to leave. You would get a job while you lived there, they would help you get into housing, and it would be this whole inclusive thing.